everybody, and welcome back to Hoffman Reproductions. This is going to be part 3 of our patch knife making video. You will recall on our last segment we finished grinding, sanding, and filing the blade all out to our approximate finished dimensions. We then selected a section of whitetail deer antler and fit it to the tang of the blade. And on this segment we're going to go ahead and fit the pins or rivets to the handle and affix the blade to the handle. Just a couple of things to mention before we go on. The bottom of the tang down in here, I took the time off camera to make sure that is fit flush on both sides and it's at the angle I want going lengthways in proportions to the blade. You need to take some time and work that out. Oftentimes you'll have to file down one side or the other, or even maybe shape the bottom of the tang sort of like a horseshoe in order to get it to fit snugly on both sides. If you don't, it just looks kind of sloppy, so it's important to take your time and get a good fit there before you go on with this step. What I'm going to use for rivet material is just finished nails. These are size number 6 iron finishing nails. Iron was a common choice for the 18th century for rivet material, so it works very good for that. Common ready-made size. I've got some drill bits laid out here and a little secret tool here on the bottom that I'll show you as we get going. So part 1 here, or phase 1 of this episode, is going to be getting the holes laid out and drilled. So just a second and we'll go ahead and get that taken care of. Alright, so we're ready to drill holes for our rivets. We're going to use 3 on this particular knife. You see that pattern occasionally on 18th century pieces. And important to note, the proportions of the handle and the tang are just a little strong both ways, because this knife blade can move around just a little bit during the drilling process, so you want just a little bit of wiggle room on either side in case it shifts. That way you won't be short. You can lay them out as precisely or by eye if you want to. I've seen both originally. Some were laid out very precisely, in a fairly straight line and spaced equally on both sides. Other ones it looks like it was just done by eye and it's fairly sloppy, so whatever you want to do. Here I'm laying them out very as close to possible as symmetrical and in a straight line in proportion to the handle, because it does curve, so our line's going to curve just a little bit. I've left the end of the handle long so that I can trim it to whatever the desired length of the finished piece will be. But again, you don't want things exactly where they go at this phase, because the drilling process things could shift just a little bit. On the first hole that I've got laid out, bring this in so you can see it, I have a needle point bit, and I don't use this to drill with, obviously it's way too large, but that needle point I'll use as a pilot hole starter, and I just stick it on there and twist it a little bit by hand where I have my hole laid out. That way the bit won't jump or slide. You want to drill your holes on the side of the antler that is the most flat and untextured. Deer antler tends to be fairly heavily textured, and you can file or sand as much of that off as you want. But one side or the other usually will be a little more conducive to setting up for a nice drill. So I picked the side that's a little smoother and symmetrical and not as much texturing on it. So what we're going to do first is just drill a hole through the handle material and mark the blade. You don't want to go all the way through, because that's a recipe for disaster. It can shift and throw it off all places. We're just going to go through the first layer of the handle, and when we make a little mark in the tang, stop. So that's next. And just go easy. Make sure you're where you want to be. Go slow. Okay, I've got it started. I'm going to go through the antler and mark the tang. Helps to clean the bit out in between there. Alright, that should have given us a mark on the tang. And it did. We have a nice little mark. So I'll reclamp the blade. This bit's a little bit dull, so hopefully it'll go through it alright. Oops. sharpen that bit. Too dull. Hold on a minute. Okay, so I got the first hole drilled through. Actually, I didn't heed my own advice, and I think I forged the tang at slightly too cold a temperature and made the steel very dense, so I had to throw it over there on the drill press to get the hole to go through. But as you can see, we have a hole through now. So next step is going to be getting our secondary hole drilled through this antler. Now the way that I do this, you can clamp it if you want. Usually I'll just hold it on the side of the workbench or whatever, and we're going to just kind of let this first hole be our guide. You can look straight down on it if you want from side to side to make sure you're in the realm, and just gently start and stop, applying some pressure. Make sure you're keeping it approximately straight, back and forth and up and down. Keep going. And that's more or less right in the middle on our secondary hole. So ream it out a little bit, and then we're ready for our next step. Alright, now in order to get our rivets to fit this hole, they don't quite make a drill bit that's the right size to fit this size of finishing nail. You could go a little smaller or a little larger, but for this particular one I want to use this size. It matches up good on the handle. So what I do, and you can do this on any knife that you want to, it'll work on this model but other ones too if you're struggling to get your holes right. If they're a little too small, what you can do is just take a small round needle file that I have chucked up in the drill here and put the drill on reverse. So in other words, clockwise is the way that a drill generally spins. We'll flip it the other way, counterclockwise, and you can ream these holes out. If you run it in clockwise, it will literally thread itself in there, and it may become stuck to the point to where you can't even get it out. So make sure you have it on reverse. Get both sides. Check it and see how we're doing. And that fits in there pretty good. If you get it too big, you can use a ball peen hammer on both sides and shrink the metal back up. You don't want a super tight fit, because if it's so tight you have to drive it in hard with a hammer. Most likely getting that to work on all three holes is not going to work. So again, take your time, be slow. But you want a fit, you have to exert a little bit of pressure to get it through, but not a lot, because again, for those reasons stated. So we're going to go ahead and get this fit into the hole and the handle and set up for our secondary pin drill. Alright, so we've got the knife back in, fixed into the vise, and you can see I've got my first pin in place and driven through the other side just a little bit. Usually there will be a little play in the knife with one pin, so you want to make sure that you have it, if there is any play, pivoted to where you want. Maybe you want the knife, the look you're going for, you want it to be down just a little bit or slightly up, so that's something you need to check. So you want to make sure that you lay out your hole on the back portion far enough away from the edge of the tang that you're not going to drill out the end of it. So come up just a little bit from there. And then also on this front pin, I should have mentioned this earlier, you want to make sure that you're far enough back that you're not going to interfere with the end of the handle, because typically when I shape the end, you want to have it tapered down so it's a nice transition in and out of a knife sheath. So if you've got this pin too far forward, it can be hard to set or rivet tight, and it can conflict with that radius that you have on there. So far enough back that that's not going to matter. But again, on the second one, we're going to drill through the handle and just mark the tang. We're not going to try and go all the way through because it can go off. So we're going to do the same procedure that we did on this first one to this rear one. I've got it marked out again with the needle point bit to help keep the bit from wandering. Gonna go slow and easy, make sure I'm happy with how that feels and looks. Okay, so I'm down to the tang. I'm just going to make a mark on it. Alright. Alright, so I'll take it out and drill through it on the tang now. Alright, so we pretty much repeated the same procedure we did on the first pin on the rear pin. Now at this point I'm going to go ahead and add the third pin. You can get away with just 2. It's personal preference. 3 makes for a really secure, snug fit. Plus I think it makes it look cool with the 3 in there. Historically they use both though for a slotted tang knife. 2 or 3. You can line it up, you know, like I said, symmetrical and evenly spaced, or just do it by eye, whatever you prefer. They did both, so I'll go ahead and use the same procedure and get the third pin in there. Alright, so at this point we have all 3 of our pinholes drilled and fit using the method that I demonstrated on the first one for all 3 of them. You'll notice the blade's a little bit discolored here. This first hole, the steel was pretty hard. These 2 were fine, but I actually heated this up to a dull cherry red in order to get that hole through there. So if you encounter problems in your tang, it's too hard, you can soften it just by heating it up to a cherry red and letting it cool down to room temperature. Or if you're in desperate need to get a hole through there, you can drill it while it's still red hot. You'll probably ruin your drill bit because it will draw the temper out of it, but that is one way you can get a hole through if all else fails. So what we're going to do now before we set up for our heat treat is take care of all of our final fittings. So in other words, I'm going to refine the tail end of the blade here. I want to clean that up a little bit. I want to get this handle profiled, and I want to get the tang filed to where it's pretty much going to be, because after the heat treatment we'll be limited in what we can do with some areas of this knife. So I'm going to get things shaped up the way I want, pretty close to finished project, and or shape, I guess I should say. And I'm also going to take the blade and sand it down using 100 grit sandpaper. You don't want any heavy file marks or grinder marks in the blade when you're setting up for the heat treat, because that can cause fractures. So I'm going to go ahead and get everything cleaned up, and then we'll dive into the heat treat process. Just a couple of things to note. If you get your 3 pins in and you still got some wobble in it, that's not a good thing. You don't want to rely on, when the rivets are set, or if you use epoxy, that holding your knife. You want a good solid fit. What you can do is take the knife out, and across the bottom on the tang, let me take this out, you can take a ball peen hammer, and of course you'll have to set this on a vise or an anvil, and peck the bottom of the tang, you know, hard enough that you're going to impact the metal. And what this will do is gently stretch it out lengthways. Also, it will make it go widthways a little. But if it's wobbling, chances are it's not tight across your bottom here. So by hitting it with the ball peen hammer along the bottom edge here, it's about the only area that you can get away with hitting steel cold and not cause a problem. You'll stretch that out and it will take up the slack. Also, if your holes for whatever reason are too loose, and that's where your problem is, you can also gently peen each side of the hole going around it and hitting it hard enough that you're causing a change in the metal, but not, you know, for all it's worth. On both sides you can take up any slack that may be in there. So that's something you can do to get a nice tight fit on your blade. So as I said, I'm going to go ahead and get everything right where I want it, and then we'll dive into the heat treat process. So that's coming up next. Alright, so I've got this blade shaped out pretty much to where it's going to be for the finished size and dimensions all the way around, and I have hand sanded it with 100 grit sandpaper wrapped around a file. And as far as the shaping goes, there's no real right or wrong way to hand shape a blade as far as the looks go. It's whatever you're going for. Obviously, in a historical mindset, you want to stick with shapes that were used during the 18th century, and this is one that's similar to several that I've seen. You want to make sure that across the blade you get rid of the bulk of the file marks, because they can create stress risers and cause the blade to crack in the next step that we're going to do, which is the heat treat. And I'll take you through that, each step that I use. I'd just like to say that every single blacksmith or knife maker, bladesmith, has a different way of heat treating a knife blade, and it's been described as the heart and soul of the blade, and that's true. If you don't get it right, then you'll have a real pretty paperweight instead of a good cutting, flexible blade. So it's important to do it right, but everyone does it just a little bit differently, and you'll probably find your own way of doing it. I'm just going to show you the way that I do it, and if you're getting good results with what you're doing, then stick with it. Again, each one will be a little bit different. I want to pan out though and show you just a few things here. You always have the problem when heat treating a blade. Well, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but the main one is either a crack, which comes from several different reasons, or a warp. There's various things that we're going to do that it's important to do in order to avoid both of those, but one thing real quick I want to cover is how to overcome a warped blade. So if you've ever seen shows like Forged in Fire, you'll see there's always a possibility when you pull your blade out of the forge and you quench it, there's a possibility of a warp. Now, warp can happen for several different reasons. Forging at too high or too low of a temperature, uneven hammer work, uneven shaping, the blade quenched too hot or too cold, all those variables can mix in. But there are ways to overcome that. Now, one that is popular, again, not to bash them, but shows like Forged in Fire, is when it comes out and it's warped, you'll see a blacksmith take it and push it over something like the anvil and start jacking on it, pushing on it, and levering on it. That is Russian roulette. You are risking breaking your knife, or if you don't break it, you're putting micro cracks in it that will result in a broken blade later on down the road. I don't advocate that process. Some do. They're comfortable with it. I don't, for the reasons stated. So what I do, if a blade comes out of the forge warped, and even though you may have taken all the necessary precautions, they can still warp on you, especially the thinner and longer the blade. Something you have to be concerned with the longer the blade gets. This one's pretty short. It's only around 4.5 inches, but still there's a possibility of this happening. What I will do to help overcome this is, after I've quenched the blade, put it down in the oil, and you don't want to pull it out instantaneously. You want to leave it down in there for about 5 to 10 seconds. I'll pull it out, and what I have here is a steel plate mounted in the vise. It's about 4 inches wide, 12 inches long, and a 1/4 inch thick. So I'll set the hot blade on this plate. Let's say it would be bowed this way, so the bow will face up. Take a flattened block of wood or another piece of steel, as long as it's dead flat. Place it on the over top the knife blade. Take a C-clamp at the front and the back of the blade and tighten them up, and you want to torque them on down tight. Now, this is safe because it won't let the blade flex past flat where it belongs. It doesn't always work to get rid of all the warp, but I've had good luck with greatly reducing it or getting rid of a lot of it. It doesn't always work, but it's a safe way of doing it, and it more or less ensures that you're not going to overdo it and damage your blade. So I will demonstrate that as we actually cover the quenching process, and again, each step that I take, I'll go ahead and show you so you don't miss anything. The type of oil that I'm going to use, you can just see there, Great Value vegetable oil. That's what I use. It's simple. You can spend a lot of money on high-end quenching oils, and again, if that's what you're happy with, you can use that. You can use all kind of things. Old motor oil, mineral oil is popular, vegetable, canola oils, even automatic transmission fluid. This obviously is cheap. It's like $5. I've had very good luck with it. Gets steel very hard. You can reuse it multiple times. It's not like you can only use it for a few blades and then you got to throw it out. So I use vegetable oil, and I've had good results with it. So I'm going to go ahead and get set up for the quench, and I'll show you how I go about that. Alright, a little handheld action here for you. We're just about ready to go. I've got my straightening jig all ready. Got my blade sitting here ready to go, pair of pliers, pair of gloves. One thing about heat treating, you want to have everything ready to go. Everything you're going to need, you want out. You don't want to have to scramble because this happens fast and you need to be all rigged and set up for it. My quench tank is over here on my wood burner preheating. Whatever type of oil you're using, it may have certain particulars that you want to follow, you know, recommendations from the manufacturer. Most quenching oils you preheat. You want to preheat it to between 90 and 120 degrees. If it's cooler than 90 degrees, it will cool the steel off too fast, which can crack it or damage it. If it's too hot, the other effects. So you want it between 90 and 120 degrees. I'm going to lay this out. This is kind of an old-time method. I've found it helps a little bit, but to completely eliminate it, I would say no. If you align your quench tank north and south, it does help minimize the effects of warpage a little bit. To completely cure it, I wouldn't say that, but it does help a little bit if you take the time, use a compass and lay it out north to south. So I'm going to go ahead and get the camera and the tripod and show you in real time how I go about doing this. Alright, hold on just a minute. Alright, so I'm not going to be doing a lot of talking while I'm doing this. I'm just going to let you observe and see what's going on. I've got everything laid out that I need. I've got a rag sitting here that I can wipe the blade off after it comes out of the oil. Check it for straightness. Oil's right here in front of the camera. I can't do a shot on that, I'm afraid. I only got one camera, so I have to go with that. Blade and tongs are ready, straightening jig is ready, fire is ready, so we're going to begin. And traditionally this was done in the coal forge. Even sword blades, they would create forges that were long and narrow for this purpose. It's oftentimes done in a heat treating oven or propane forge, but traditionally you can do it with a coal forge. There's some advantages too to a coal forge that we'll get into in another episode, but to begin, we're going to take the blade and put it with the back or spine down, cutting edge facing up. Go ahead and put it into about the middle of the fire. And you want a good clean fire when you're doing this, no clinkers or impurities. And again, this blade's small, so it's not going to take long, but you use the same basic procedure no matter what blade length or shape you're doing. Just going to let it sit there for a minute, soak up a little heat. You want a nice even heat when you're doing this, no hot spots. You want to watch the cutting edge and the tip because they'll tend to heat up faster than the rest of the knife, and you got to be careful you don't overheat it. As far as temperature goes, I do it by eye because I've done it so many times. I know what I'm looking for. If you're new to this and you haven't done it before, you can use a magnet because when steel comes to a critical temperature, when it's ready to be quenched, a magnet will no longer attract to it. So you can use that if you're new to it, and once you get some experience under your belt, you can just do it by eye the way I'm going to do it. So we'll go ahead and do this in real time and show you how to heat treat. Harden the blade. Just about where I want it. I'm going to flip it over so the cutting edge is down just for a few seconds. Okay, cutting edge down into the oil. I fully submerge my blades all the way down, and you want to rock it back and forth so that the atmosphere stays the same around the blade, no hot or cold spots. I'll give it a little sight down. It looks pretty straight. Give it a quick wipe. The color looks really good on it. I think we got it good and hard. Quick sight down. We got a little warp to it. Stick it in the straightening jig and see if we can get rid of it. Obviously you want to have these laid out ahead of time so they're good to go. And we'll just let that set in there until it comes down to room temperature. You don't want to rush it. Be very careful because the blade is highly fragile at this point. It's like a piece of glass. If you were to drop it, it could break very easily. So we'll just let that set and see what we got. Okay, we had a slight warp in this blade when I took it out of the oil. We took it over to the straightening jig, and you can make this setup as large as you need. I even use it on sword blades, different proportions, and we were able to get rid of it. As you can see now, the blade is nice and straight, no kinks or warps in it. I'm going to show on a separate video, if it's still warped, there are ways of safely and very effectively getting a warped and crooked knife blade straight that doesn't damage the knife. It takes some practice, but very doable, and it comes in handy if you have lots and lots of time on something fancy you're working on and it warped and you think it's ruined. It's not. You can straighten it, and again, I'll demonstrate that on a later video. The old-time method of testing, if a blade is good and hard, I can tell this one is a good color. It's a gray color, which is what you're looking for. You just take a file, a sharp file, or fairly, it doesn't have to be brand new, bear down on the edge, and it should just more or less slide. Some steels that have a, and that one tested good, some steels that have a lower carbon content, a brand new file might bite into it just a little bit, but 9 times out of 10 you don't want it to. So that one tests good. And another thing, you don't want to pull it out of the oil too quickly because it didn't have time to align properly and get hard. You want to leave it down in the oil, you know, around 5 or 8 seconds before you pull it out and run over here to the straightening jig. So the next step is tempering, which I'll set up for and show you here in just a second. Alright, so what I've done to set up for the tempering, and tempering, just in case you're not familiar with it, after hardening or quenching, a blade is not heat treated. It's extremely fragile right now. If I were to drop it on the ground, it most likely would break in half. I've learned that lesson the hard way, so you need to be really careful with a blade that's been quenched. It's so hard at this point, you need to remove some of that and give the blade some flexibility. Now there's a great many different ways that you can temper a knife blade. Historically it was done many different ways. What I like to use is what's called a soft back draw. In other words, we'll start at the spine or the rearward portion of the blade that is the thickest. We're going to apply heat to it and look for a color oxidation, which is going to be an indicator of the temperature. A lot of guys like to use heat treating ovens, where you put the blade in, set it to a certain temperature, and more or less bake the blade for a set amount of time. That's fine if that's the way you're doing it. Again, you'll find a method that you prefer. I like this method because it's what's called a differential heat treat, having a soft back and a hard cutting edge, which makes the blade have both flexibility and toughness, and in my opinion is an advantage to a fully hardened and tempered blade. So what I'm going to do is I've got that same piece of steel mounted in the vise, and I use the same setup tempering method for small patch knife blades, clear out to dirk size blades that you know are 15 inches. I actually just did this method with a 29-inch sword blade that I'm making right now. You have to do it in sections, but the same thing applies. So your piece of steel laid in, or tightened in the vise. I've sanded this blade to with 100 grit sandpaper so that it shines and I can see the colors. So you're going to lay it flat and then take a scrap piece of steel. This is about 3/16 of an inch thick, about 9 inches long, again whatever you need, and you're going to cover the cutting edge of the blade and the tip, leaving about a third, you can't really see it, but a third of the blade exposed. So it's covering the cutting edge and leaving the back exposed. And then I'm going to take a propane torch, paint it across the back of the knife, and when I see a blue color, well, when I see a pale yellow color starting, I'm getting close. This process takes practice. You can practice it on mild steel all you want, over and over again. It does take some practice to get good at it this way, but it yields a really good, flexible, tough knife blade. Anyway, I'm going to paint it on the back. When I get the back to a blue color, I'm going to take this piece off, and I should be getting close on my cutting edge because the heat will go down to the thin part. When it gets to a pale to a medium yellow, then I'll stop, and behind me is my quench oil, and I'll halt the tempering in that. I don't use water because that's a lot of stress on a hot blade, and I cracked one doing that once, so I use oil when I want to halt the process. I'll sand it off and repeat it 2 more times. So in total you're going to get 3 tempers. That more or less ensures that you've got all that brittleness out, and it should be good and tough and flexible. So I'll demonstrate in real time the first one, how it works, so you can see it, how long it's taken me. I want to hang the tang over the edge here so I can get a hold of it with a pair of pliers when it's up to temperature. And I'll show you how I go about this process. Okay, you can't see it on camera, but I've got a pale yellow starting on the back. And again, you have to be careful, and it takes practice to get that evenly across the blade, especially out in the tip, because that tends to want to go faster, so you got to be careful not to put too much heat there. But we need to keep going and get the spine of the blade to a blue color, which in steel, that's the flexible part. That's what will enable it to bend and flex back to true, and the hard cutting edge will be on the bottom. Okay, I'm pretty close on that, so I'm going to throw it down in the oil. And you can't really see it on camera, so I'm not going to attempt to show it, but the colors are the blue on the back and brown in the middle and pale yellow on down near the cutting edge, and you want to repeat that 2 more times. Okay, you can't really see it very well, but the colors on here again are dark on the spine and straw yellow down on the cutting edge, and just a little bit of violet or blue in the tip. I like to make my tips just a little bit on the softer side, because that way under stress they'll give just a little bit as opposed to snap off, because you can always straighten a knife blade a little bit, but if it snaps off, you know, you're regrinding and shaping it and it's a bad deal. So this is the second tempering cycle. I've got 1 more. Be careful when messing with your cover, top and bottom, because obviously they're very hot now. You go to grab it, you'll get burnt. And be mindful that in each successive tempering cycle, it gets hot a lot faster and comes up to temperature. So if maybe it took a minute or 2 to get it the first time, the second and third time it's much faster, because when I put it in the oil, I'm only leaving it in there, for about 10 seconds to cool it off and stop the tempering cycle. So be mindful of that, and again, you want to do it 3 times. Alright everybody, we finished up with our last tempering cycle and everything's going pretty good. Hopefully it is for you too. We've got the handle shape just about where I want it, and we're really ready for the final finishing and fit on this knife, which I'm going to show in the next video. Show you how to set the rivets, clean the blade up. We're going to antique the handle and the blade. Just something to be aware of when on the subject of heat treating a knife blade. Historically, tangs of knives, be it a hidden tang or a slotted tang or a half tang, were not hardened. Even on sword blades from the medieval period, clear on up into the 1800s, they were not quenched hard. They were left soft. And many a time you can actually tell on originals where a piece of iron was taken and forge welded to the blade. Some have argued and said that's because steel was precious and they didn't want to waste it. Iron was more plentiful. That's possible, but people that have studied it a lot more than I have come to the conclusion that this was done in order to prevent a breakage in the tang, which is common nowadays in knives that are fully quenched and hardened. 9 times out of 10, if they're under extreme use, you've seen this on TV shows no doubt, they'll snap somewhere in the tang, and that's because it's hardened. So historically they were either made of iron or they were left soft. I leave mine soft so that under the strain and stress that someone might be putting on a knife, it's not going to break there. If you want to go ahead and quench it and draw it back and temper it, that's up to you, but historically that wasn't done, and that's the way I make my knives, with a soft tang. If you don't have a lot of play with your handle and your tang, everything's good and secure, you should not have any problems with leaving this soft. It's when you've got wobble back and forth or side to side where the junction of that is, be it hidden or slotted, where that can create a bend or a break if there's play in there. So that's another reason to keep that tight. But something to keep in mind when on the subjects of tangs and heat treating. So again, in the next video we're going to finish out this blade. I'll show you some neat little tricks and tips to antique it, and we'll demonstrate sharpening it. So once again, thank you everybody for tuning in. If you're new to our channel and you'd like to subscribe, please feel free to do that. That way you'll get the notifications when the new videos come up. So thanks so much again everybody, we really appreciate it, and until next time, take care.